Okay, in this lesson, we'll talk about bioaccumulation and biomagnification, which are related to food pyramids. So let's get going with this. So, bioaccumulation refers to the buildup or accumulation of toxins in an organism as it goes through its life. Basically, if you eat things that have toxins in them and those toxins remain in your body, then they will tend to accumulate. So, in order for a substance to accumulate in a body, there's several criteria it must reach. First of all, it has to be long lived. So, if a toxin has a very short lifespan, so a short half life, it won't have a chance to build up in a person's or any organism's body. It has to be capable of moving throughout an ecosystem. So, say a lump of radioactive material, yeah, it's not going to be mobile, so it's not going to accumulate in organisms. So it has to be something that basically gets into the food or water, into the water or air. And the other thing is, it generally needs to be fat soluble. If it is fat soluble, it tends to reside within an organism and not get flushed out of the organism. And basically, what we find is it's usually those things that are fat soluble that really tend to build up over the lifespan of an organism or accumulate. Now, bioaccumulation is not necessarily something that humans have forced upon nature. It's definitely something that's always been there. For instance, where I come from in the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, Puget Sound, we love to eat oysters. I don't know if you like them. I love them. Oysters, clams, mussels, they're delicious. They're filter feeding organisms. And what happens is there's a particular type of dinoflagellate that of phytoplankton that a type of algae that occurs in high concentrations at certain times during the year called a red tide, and they have a lot of this toxin that causes neurologic problems. Well, since these oysters don't have a central nervous system, it doesn't really bother them. But what happens is these toxins tend to accumulate over time in these shellfish. Now, it turns out that these toxins have a fairly short half life. So during a plankton bloom, these oysters will accumulate a lot of the toxin. But then after that bloom is over the following months, the toxin level in the oyster will go back down. Now, if this was something that was more persistent, well, these oysters would have this toxin for a long time. But it is interesting. These things get up enough they can actually kill a person. Ask me, I'll tell you a story about a guy who ate them. He didn't die, but it's a pretty amazing story. Ask me in class about it. Organisms have used this to their advantage. So bioaccumulation is something to say poison arrow frogs, blue-ringed octopi, a number of many actually organisms in nature have used bioaccumulation as a way of defending themselves. So I'm sure you've heard of poison arrow frogs. They're absolutely beautiful. They're endemic to Central and South America, and they are among the most deadly poisonous animals on the planet. But they don't manufacture their own toxins. Instead, they accumulate them by eating different insects and other arthropods like centipedes and what have you. So they accumulate the poisons over their lifespan to make themselves toxic. It doesn't affect the frogs, but it keeps them from being eaten by predators. But, and the reason we're going to talk about it is it also happens for things we don't want. Now, in the 1800s, there's a very famous case of this. In the 1800s, and even before then, beaver fur was used to make felt hats. And these were very popular. So the felting process involved taking beaver pelts and soaking it in a mercury compound that would basically change the surface proteins so that they would mat together to form felt. And these workers would have to basically stick their hands into the mercury. Well, what happens is, you start your job, you get a little bit of mercury in you, no problem. But mercury is definitely a heavy metal that is fat soluble. And over time, these people would acquire more and more and more of this mercury. So bioaccumulation happened in these workers until they end up having neurologic problems. And one of those neurologic problems involved cognitive impairments and changes in mood and changes in behavior. And it gave rise to the term mad as a hatter. These people had very uh, bizarre behavioral tendencies. And so it worked its way into, I don't know if it's Alice in Wonderland or Alice with Looking Glass. I'm ashamed to say I don't know which one it's in. Now, biomagnification is a specific case of bioaccumulation. And the idea here is this. As food moves up through different trophic levels, the toxins in it get moved upwards as well. And so basically, if I eat an organism that has toxins in it, those toxins end up in me. But because I'm at a higher level than the thing below me, I'm going to acquire all of its toxins. So I'm going to have more, it's going to accumulate in me more rapidly than it does lower down in the food chain. So what we find is that basically toxins in nature get taken up by, say, phytoplankton or plants. And then the first order consumers, they basically get all those toxins into their bodies. And then the second order consumers acquire all of that. And so there's this accelerated increase in toxin levels as we move up in trophic levels. And we call this biomagnification. So here is a graphic trying to show you the difference between bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So bioaccumulation just means the buildup of toxins over time. Sorry, that's still there. You guys had to show me how to get rid of that. Biomagnification is a form of bioaccumulation, but it is at an increasing rate because of the trophic levels. So here we're just showing like basically one species of fish gradually accumulating toxins over time, whereas here we see the krill have a little bit of toxin. They get eaten by fish that accumulate more. They get eaten by a seal that accumulate more. That get eaten by a polar bear that accumulates all this. So basically, this polar bear is accumulating all the toxins that were present in all the levels below it. So there's a magnification of the level that's present at higher trophic levels. Let's see. All right. So a very important and unfortunately persistent one of these is PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. They're a toxic chemical. Yeah, they have a variety of uses. We'll get into it later in the year. But they were banned a long time ago. But they're very persistent. They have a very, very long half-life, and they just won't go away. And so because they're so long-lasting, and they may be very dilute in seawater, generally speaking, but they tend to accumulate in phytoplankton and then magnify as they move through the food web. So we still find to this day that apex predators and high order consumers still have significant levels of this in their bodies, and it causes illness and sometimes death of these organisms. So what we see is it doesn't quite follow the 10% rule. It often accumulates much quicker than that, or I should say it often magnifies much more quickly than that. So we see like here we've got, in the water there may be like just a tiny amount, like a tiny number of it. But what happens is as we go up each trophic level, we get an amplification of the amount of toxin that's present. So we find as DDT is a pesticide that seemed like a miracle when it came out because it had a very long lifespan, so it would keep poisoning insects, and it didn't affect humans, at the levels we sprayed it at. So people thought, well, this is great. But what they found it's true that the amount we spray it for to kill insects doesn't really affect humans. Unfortunately, this is really the substance by which we really learned about biomagnification, because all of a sudden there weren't a lot of eagles or osprey or higher order predators, especially birds. And we found is that it was having an effect on their ability to make shells for their offspring, and that the levels of DDT present in these higher order predators was significantly, vastly higher than it was in the just the water and the air. And here's just a list, you can look at it, but it's just a list of some of the substances that have a tendency to undergo biomagnification, and they meet that criteria of being long-lasting and fat-soluble. And the last thing I want to talk about is a kind of interesting one, and it's a fun one. You've probably heard the story, and if you haven't, it's awesome, and it's true. It's called Operation Cat Drop. Here you go. Okay, so at the end of World War II, the British government realized that the people in Sarawak, Borneo, who had a problem with malaria. It was often, malaria is endemic to many tropical environments. And so they thought, well, what? There's this newly invented substance called DDT, an organophosphate, and it seemed like a miracle at the time. So they're like, we're going to go help these people. So they went in and they flew over their area and they sprayed DDT to kill these malarial mosquitoes, and it worked. No more malaria. That's great. But then here's what happened. Okay, so the mosquitoes had a little bit of this toxin in them, and they got sick. And it was easier for geckos to eat the sick mosquitoes than it was the ones that weren't contaminated with DDT. So what happened was the level of DDT in the geckos increased, it magnified, and then the geckos got sick from having all this DDT in them. So the sick geckos were easier prey for cats. So the cats ate these geckos. Well, these cats started having really weird behaviors, and they just got really sick and died. So there was no more cats, which you wouldn't think would be a problem, except that cats were kept around because they ate rats. And without cats, now you ended up with rats instead. These rats, guess what? Instead of malaria, they had the bubonic plague. So now these poor people, instead of dying of malaria, they're dying of bubonic plague. And to make matters even worse, one of the organisms that was killed by the DDT were wasps. Now, these wasps played a role in the ecosystem of laying eggs in caterpillars. The many wasp species do this. Well, without the wasp to lay eggs, and these eggs basically, when they hatch, they kill and eat the caterpillars. It's kind of gross. But without the wasp, then the population of caterpillars just exploded. And these caterpillars like to eat the very type of material that these people in Borneo built their houses out of. So these people went from having malaria to having bubonic plague and no houses. And so the British government decided, well, what we need, where we're going to fix this is we're going to give them more cats. And they literally had a program where they flew over these villages and they dropped cats in crates with parachutes, and they call it Operation Cat Drop. It's just one of the, I think, to me, I think most people, it is an excellent example of the unintended consequences of trying to manipulate what is really a very complex thing, that being an ecosystem. All right, so that's got it for this one here. We'll see you in class tomorrow. We're going to do a lab on bioaccumulation and magnification.